This is Sam Black with Drafting Archetypes, and today I'm going to be discussing red-black in Duskmourn. As always, the notes are available to follow along at patreon.com/draftingarchetypes. Red-black is the second least drafted color pair, so it's not drafted very much, but it is the fourth most successful. So it performs pretty well, but people don't draft it very much. Which is interesting to me because I think there's like a lot of support and it's high synergy. It's not one of those archetypes where there's like a suggested theme that doesn't work. The support's there, the power level's there. So it's a little bit surprising that it's not drafted so much. I think the explanation is that it wants cards that most other decks don't want. So it's hard to pivot into or out of, and that makes it difficult to commit to early, because if the cards end up not being there, then you have a bunch of cards that you can't really use anywhere else. And so I think there's like correctly a pressure to not put yourself in this space. And then once you see that it's open, it's hard to move into it because the cards that you have aren't likely to play well with the cards that you'd like want for this archetype. So you kind of have to just kind of like move in pretty early on some kind of reasonably good card for it and hope that it's there. The good news is that it usually is, because it's so rarely drafted, and there is a lot of support for it, and the cards that you want, very few other people want basically any of them. So I think it's good to draft, but not safe to draft. In general, I'm not a believer in, like, sometimes people ask questions like, okay, so it's like the second draft in a Grand Prix, you need to 3-0 to top 8. Is there a deck that you draft specifically to 3-0? I generally feel like you just draft. Like, you take the good cards and, you know, you don't do something different based on like needing a 3-0 or needing a 2-1. But I could see an argument that this deck, more than most, kind of fits in that space where you have a pretty good expectation that it's going to work since it's not very drafted, all the stuff I've said. But if someone else is in it, or if the cards just aren't there, you might be in a lot of trouble because it's hard to pivot out of. So do with that what you will in terms of what it says about how often you should or shouldn't draft it. So that's kind of its positioning. Well, before I get into the like best commons and uncommons, let me talk about its strategic positioning, what the deck is trying to do and how it fits into the format. So red-black has this like sacrifice theme, which means that you want to draft cheap cards that give you value when you sacrifice them or they die. Things like Clockwork Percussionist and Innocuous Rat. Clockwork Percussionist is the red 1/1 haste artifact creature that when it dies exiles the top card of your library and you can play it until the end of your next turn. And Innocuous Rat is the 1 and a black 1/1 that when it dies, you manifest the top card of your library. So you want that kind of card to support the things that want you to sacrifice something. That kind of card is good in the deck because it has a lot of synergy and it's like pretty reasonable at attacking early. But it's not good to draw in the late game because it's a low impact card. Given that you want like a bunch of cheap creatures to sacrifice to fuel your stuff, you're structurally in the creatures then removal spells rather than removal spells then creatures kind of space, which ballpark means that you're an aggressive deck rather than a controlling deck. A thing that I've started talking about somewhat frequently more recently is this idea that aggressive decks play creatures, then removal spells, so you get on board, kill your opponent's blockers, and attack, whereas control decks are more likely to play removal spells, so you don't fall behind early, you answer your opponent's evasive threats, you don't want to be in a spot where your opponent has a threat, you play a creature, they kill it, and they hit you. You'd rather be in a spot where they play a creature, you kill it, and then if they have a removal spell, they fail to apply more pressure. And then you're more likely to have expensive creatures that turn the game around or, go over the top or whatever. So your removal spells, then creatures in control decks, creatures, then removal spells in aggressive decks. So red-black wants a bunch of cheap creatures, and some of its removal spells, like Final Vengeance, the Bone Splinters variant in this set, black, sorcery, sack a creature, or enchantment, exile target creature, needs you to have creature, although this one can use enchantments, but for the most part wants you to have a creature in play early so that you can cast it. So you kind of have to be creatures then removal. In that way, you're kind of naturally set up to be an aggressive deck just because you're going to have creatures in play and then you're going to have these removal spells and you're going to want to kill your opponent's blockers so the creatures that you have in play are doing something. Also, when you look at the larger format positioning, blue in this format is pretty good and has a lot of strong card advantage. The fact that both Glimmerburst and Meatlocker are commons that are pretty good means that if you're a red-black deck that's trying to play a hard attrition plan rather than an aggressive plan, the blue deck is going to out-card advantage your nickel and dime type leftover object card advantage that you get out of red-black. So you don't really want to be going into a late game with them. And you don't really want to be going into a late game with most decks because you have all these really low impact cards in your deck. So to avoid the spot where you're top decking, but a lot of your cards don't matter and your opponent's going to be drawing way more significant cards, or the spot where you're playing an attrition game against blue decks that are drawing a lot more cards than you really need your cheap creatures to be pushing damage. The synergies are all real and important. The fact that you can get card advantage out of your removal spells matters, but all of this stuff needs to be about mounting pressure and pushing damage and getting toward the end of the game. So you do want the grindy synergy stuff. You just need that to be the backdrop for an aggressive start and to focus on, the thing that you're accomplishing with all this stuff is getting attacks in. So that's kind of what I think red-black needs to be up to. So this is a pretty common dynamic for red-black, right? Red-black has a lot of removal spells in general, and, you usually want, some creatures that are attacking while you play removal spells. It's usually pretty aggressive. However, there is the potential sometimes to play red-black control attrition strategies where, you have some big creatures and some card advantage, some grindy elements and a bunch of removal, and you end up playing a control game. And this makes more sense the more dragons you have, random creatures that like bombs, your typical bombs and removal control deck in limited. The thing is, even at rare and mythic, there are very few red or black cards in Duskmourn that are really strong and make you want to play that kind of game. This isn't a set where there are a bunch of dragons. There is the room that makes a demon, and then there are the two overlords at Mythic. And you could splash Valgaboth's Onslaught, the Manifest X card, but most of the red and black rare creatures are just cheap aggressive cards. So it's very rare that you're going to be in a spot where you're in red black, but it's because of some rare that makes you comfortable playing a long game. Like, this isn't a set that really has that kind of element. So you're basically always going to be interested in damaging your opponent as like a serious part of your game plan. That's not to say that any of the synergy stuff is like fake or misleading. It's just that this is something you need to be thinking about when you're drafting and building your deck and playing your games. Like, you need to have creatures, and you care more about those creatures having power than you care about most of the other elements of the creatures, because you're going to be killing a lot of your opponent's blockers. So you just want to be getting in. So a card like Most Valuable Slayer, the 4-mana 2/4 that gives a creature +1/+0 and first strike, isn't very good here, because that's good for like getting your creatures past blockers, but in red black it doesn't have a good like power to mana ratio, and you're mostly just like killing the things that would block anyway. So that's not the kind of creature you're looking for. You're looking for something like, say, Piggy Bank. 1 in red, 3/2, dies into a treasure, just because it has 3 power and 2 toughness for 2 mana. And so I said you mostly want power, but also toughness does matter somewhat, specifically if your creature has 1 toughness and doesn't have an ability that like triggers when it dies, then you might have a problem where your opponent makes tokens and you really don't have to use your removal spells on their tokens, and then you can't keep attacking. So 3/2 is a pretty good stat line, but 2/2s work. Hand that feeds, the 1 in red 2/2 that gets +2/+0 and menace if you have delirium, works pretty well if your deck is set up to get delirium. But I don't know that it's all that important which creatures you have, as long as you have like some 1 and 2 mana creatures that you know that you need to be like planning to attack with, and you don't just like your early game shouldn't be just all removal spells, right? Like, you can play like Winter's Intervention and stuff. I think that's the name of the 1 in a black, deal 2, gain 2. But that's not a good fit for this deck. You shouldn't be worried about gaining life. You have more effective removal spells for attacking than that. You have enough removal spells that you really shouldn't need to like go there. Leave that for like a blue-black deck or whatever, and take just like a 2 mana creature or something instead. So, understanding that that's what we're trying to do, looking at the top performing commons and uncommons, the top performing common in red-black is Glimmerlight. This isn't terribly surprising. It's one of the best performing commons in the set, and it works well with having like a bunch of random little disposable creatures. Makes all of your percussionists and rats and manifests able to attack more reliably, deals with the problem of your opponent having 1/1s and that invalidating some of your attacks. It's 2 objects in 1 card for 2 mana, so it works well with sacrificing and stuff. Very, very good fit here. I think it's underrated in red-black. I think looking at how frequently and when cards are drafted relative to their win rate, Glimmerlight's the only thing that stands out as like, this isn't in as many red and black decks as it should be, and it doesn't like go super early relative to some of the cards that people are putting in their red and black decks. So I think Glimmerlight is important, underrated, and despite being very successful, and is definitely a card you should be looking for. Final Vengeance, the removal spell that I talked about earlier, Clockwork Percussionist, the 1/1 haste for 1 that I talked about earlier, Glassworks, the room that does 4 damage to a creature, and then for 5 mana becomes an enchantment that does 1 to your opponent every turn. This is, just good removal spell that gives you an object that you can sacrifice, and also some reach, ways to push damage in the late game to stop your opponent from kind of stabilizing and turning the corner. Innocuous Rat, the 2-mana 1/1 that dies into a manifest. Scorching Dragonfire, 1 in red, deal 3, exile. And Fear of Lost Teeth, the black 1/1 that deals 1 to any target and gains life when it dies. Enchantment creature. So just like little creatures that give you value and removal spells are the best performing commons. Top uncommons, Razorkin Horde Caller, the 5-mana 4/4 that makes a 1/1 whenever you attack, is the top performer, followed by Nowhere to Run. That's the black enchantment that -3/-3 and ignores ward and hexproof and stuff. Again, just a removal spell that gives you an object. Disturbing Mirth, the red-black uncommon that lets you sacrifice a thing to draw 2 and manifests when it dies. Vengeful Possession, the threaten. Piggy Bank, the 3/2. Betrayer's Bargain, the 2-mana sacrifice a thing or pay 2 extra mana to deal 5 and exile. And Fear of Burning Alive, the 6-mana 4/4 that deals 4, and if you have Delirium, it deals 4 to an opponent, and if you have Delirium, when you deal damage to an opponent, it also deals damage to creatures. So, pretty typical good uncommons, but still very much in the, we're looking for sacrifice synergies space. Disturbing Mirth is very significant. It's a really good card, and, suggests very much this attrition plan where you're sacrificing something to draw cards, but then you sacrifice it for more value, which means you need more synergy, but the value you're getting is just another creature. It's a good card that gives you more fuel to let you keep going, but it doesn't change the dynamic that I've been discussing. I've seen a lot of good red-black decks have 3 copies of Disturbing Mirth, because sacrificing Disturbing Mirth to Disturbing Mirth is awesome, because you get your manifest, which you want to get as soon as possible, and you get to draw the 2 cards from the next one. And, this lets you kind of chain value and snowball a bit, but it's all, cheap and in line with attacking. So yeah, it plays well in the game plan rather than really changing the game plan. The last thing I want to touch on is, one more quick note about specific cards. Murder, 1 black, destroy target creature, common, instant. Totally reasonable card to play, but, again, looking at when it's taken, how often it's played compared to its win rate, suggests that it's probably appreciably overrated. It's a fine card, but nothing special. The rate's just not that good. You'd rather have the more specifically synergistic removal spells. Which again, it's not to say that if you draft Murder you shouldn't play it or that you should avoid drafting it, but you might want to take a good creature over it and find a different removal spell later on. So the other note, this deck doesn't really want to splash. You're a high synergy, somewhat color intensive, low curve aggro deck. You can often get away with playing fewer than 17 lands. The only real exceptions are Vel'Gavoth's Onslaught, the XX green Manifest X rare, and the Swarm Weaver, the 2 black-green creature that makes 2 insects and gives them +1/+1 and Death Touch if you have Delirium. Those are very, very strong and pretty easily splashable and work well enough with what you're doing. But for the most part, you really want to stick to just straight red-black here. This is always what I'm going to tell you with aggressive archetypes. So that covers what I have to say about this. So I'm going to move on to questions from chat. So if anyone has any questions, please don't hesitate to send them to Twitch chat, and I will get to them shortly. In the meantime, I want to thank the newest patron at patreon.com/draftingarchetypes. So, Jamie, thank you very much for the support. Really appreciate it. If anyone else is interested in supporting the program, be sure to check out patreon.com/draftingarchetypes. First question. When you say disturbing mirth for more value, what kind of value do you mean? When you say you sacrifice disturbing mirth for more value, I mean, like, the text of disturbing mirth, right? Like, it does two things. It lets you sacrifice a thing to draw 2 cards, and then when you sacrifice it, you manifest. So the first value you get out of it is when you cast it, you sacrifice something and draw 2 cards. And then when you sacrifice it, you get more value in that you trigger the second ability and you get another creature. So the value that I mean is manifesting. Can you talk about the difference between red-black good cards deck versus red-black sack synergy options? Interesting framing. I hadn't strongly considered that there could be a red-black deck that's not really doing the sack synergy stuff. Because, like, so the issue is that the black cards aren't that good, right? Like, the red and black gold cards are sack synergy cards, and the strong red cards in, like, other decks aren't necessarily strong in red black, and, like, I don't know that I believe in a red black good cards deck that's like a distinct thing from a red black sack synergy deck, I guess is my answer. Like, I could imagine that you can have more or less of the sack synergy stuff, but it just seems hard for me to, like, imagine exactly how a draft is going such that you don't have any of the sack synergy stuff and you're supposed to be in red-black, given that, like, there's so many of the cards that do that thing and they go so late and there's not really, like, a different thing to be doing because the uncommons want to do that and the commons that, like, go late and make sense do that. I'm not saying it's not possible to have a deck where you just, like, or to have a draft where you just happen to not see any of the sack synergy stuff and you just, like, get, like, a large number of, like, I don't know, good uncommons and rooms and stuff. But I suspect that almost every red-black deck is meaningfully doing the sacrifice thing. What about the green-black spider? I assume we're talking about the 2-drop uncommon. That doesn't seem like a card that I'd really want to splash in red-black. Like, it's very good. I think that splashing the 2-mana uncommons can be pretty good, especially with, like, manifest stuff. I think it would be a good card to play if you were already splashing green for Onslaught or Swarmweaver. But I don't think I want to, like, mess up my mana for an off-color 2-drop in a red-black deck. How does Fear of Lost Teeth earn its spot in the deck? It seems too weak to me, but I see good players including it in their decks. I mean, just the fact that it does a damage to any target when it dies, and you get to have it die on command, and there are, like, a decent number of, like, 1 toughness creatures around, and it's also, like, you're not, like, enchantment creature for Delirium is pretty nice, and just, like, aggressive 1-mana creature is pretty nice, and it also, like, can attack into 2/2s, right? Like, if your opponent manifests and you have that, you can attack. And if they block, they trade. So it's, like, a little bit better at pushing damage than it might look. Yeah, it's a acceptable 1-mana spell to sacrifice to Disturbing Mirth, which is certainly something you can be looking for. Surprised Irreverent Gremlin didn't come up for a good uncommon for this base, considering... So, I mean, Irreverent Gremlin's good. I believe it's, like, literally the next best uncommon stats-wise after Fear of Burning Alive. It's just I stopped listing cards at some point to avoid an impossibly long list, and Irreverent Gremlin was the exact cutoff. But it's a very good card. It should be in your decks. It's, you know, like, better than Fear of Lost Teeth. I just didn't mention it because, you know, the bar for uncommons is a little higher than the bar for commons to be worth mentioning. Some ratio or number of cards that you want of good things to sack versus cards that sack things. I mean, conceptually you want more good things to sacrifice than cards that sacrifice things, right? Because like you want more of the like prerequisite, whereas if you have like more of the stuff that needs to sacrifice, then you're gonna like strand some of it, or it's gonna be bad because you're gonna have to sacrifice something that's not good to sacrifice. As to like exact number of each, I don't have one in mind. It's not something that I've like thought about, and I haven't like drafted this enough to have like a map for it or anything. Basically, I think, you just want to like it's not that hard to have like most of your cards give you a good thing to sacrifice in one way or another with like Clockwork Percussionist and Glimmerlight and Rat and every room and nowhere to run type stuff, Disturbing Mirth. Like it's very easy in these colors to have stuff that's good to sacrifice. So broadly, I'm just like, take stuff that's in one bucket or the other, and it'll probably work out. That's the thing about how I think that this archetype is just very deeply supported. What about splashing the red-white uncommon, make 3 gremlins? It's a good card. It fits well in the strategy. Again, it's not how I want to be spending my picks, like taking that and taking the lands to support it and then having the like awkward lands. But, I could see taking that, like pivoting into red black after having that, taking that early when I might pivot out of red black, ending up with it in my pool, looking for some like white lands that I happen to get late, just in case it comes together and I want to splash it. And if I get like, 3 to 4 white dual lands or something, then maybe I put it in. I don't think it's something that you should prioritize, but I could see it coming together. Do you think there's a Jund Delirium deck? And if so, how does this deck relate to it? Yes, I do. And I think the decks are very different, but they involve some overlapping pieces. I think that the Jund Delirium deck it can use Disturbing Mirth and likes potentially stuff like Innocuous Rat and Fear of Lost Teeth and Clockwork Percussionist, because all of those are pretty good at putting multiple types in the graveyard. And if you have those things with some sacrifice synergies, then you can pretty easily get like 3 types in the graveyard very quickly while getting some like value out of that stuff. I think Jund Delirium is more in the attrition space and typically less aggressive, but I think it's like solidly mid-range. Like you are still generally pressuring your opponent, and you do like you want to be attacking, but you're also a 3-color deck. You're going to be a little bit more clunky. You're not going to use 1-drops quite as well because you're going to have tap lands and stuff. So I think that like they're looking for a lot of similar cards, and they both kind of want to attack, but I think that they're pretty different strategically, where I think the Jund Delirium deck is going to have a lot more like big creatures and stuff like Moldering Gem is going to kind of change what's happening with your deck in terms of like what your curve is like, and just you're going to have a lot more like large bodies one way or another. You're going to be using your removal spells defensively more often because you're you're going to top deck a lot better. So I think that for 2 decks that want a lot of the same cards, they're strategically remarkably different. I do think that, I talked about it being hard to pivot out of this deck. I do think that that is a reasonable way to pivot out of it, since you can use a lot of the like elements of this deck in that deck. So I think it's very much like worth being aware of and thinking about that, even if they're like strategically different. The overlapping cards as a way to pivot's like definitely good to keep in mind. And of course, pivoting into green, becoming a 3-color deck is just kind of structurally pretty safe because of green being able to fix to support the 3 colors that you've become. I suppose another direction you can go with it is you can go into Grixis, and now you have like some cheap value creatures and efficient removal spells and grindy elements, and you just pair that with blue card draw, notably both Glimmer Burst and Meatlocker, like the two blue card advantage spells, both leave you with an object that you can sacrifice. So I think there's also just like Grixis Attrition is like a reasonable deck and reasonable pivot. So that there are ways to take these cards and turn them into 3-color decks. It's just that when you do that, you change your strategy appreciably. What do you think about using the black injury auras in this space? Oh, the cracked skull and the thing that makes someone sacrifice a thing. They both put another object to sacrifice on the board while also opening up some attacks for your smaller creatures, especially the Fear of Lost Teeth. Yeah. I think both those cards play pretty well there. I think that red-black is, I think red-black is the best home for both of them since, for the reasons you said. It's, spell plus object. Spell plus object is generally something that red-black is looking for. And also, the, now my tiny creatures can attack into your huge creature because your huge creature dies if it takes damage. Also works really well with what red-black is doing. So, yes. As much as I don't like Cracked Skull as a card in general, I think it's pretty reasonable in red-black. Cracked Skull is the 2 and a black enchantment that is a coercion, and when enchanted creature is dealt damage, destroy it. Do you believe in including an uncommon-based reanimation package, specifically Faithful, Live or Die, and Mutilator, in addition to Fear of Burning Alive? Do I believe that doing that is detrimental to the red-black strategy? So, when I was talking about, the idea of, there not being, a dragon that would let you play more of, a red-black attrition plan, if you play Faithful and Live or Die and Fanatic of the Harrowing and the big uncommon demon and some Blackland cyclers, it is possible to build a red-black reanimator deck. And if you have also Fear of Burning Alive, so if you have a bunch of that stuff, so the problem is that all of the black reanimation is uncommon, as you mentioned. So it's hard for it to come together. But if you were, it's coherent, right? The way that I was talking about, the problem is there aren't any dragons. There are some uncommons that kind of let you be in that space. Again, I think it seems pretty rare for it to come up because it's uncommon based, and there's still a lot of the pressures in terms of how big some of the other decks go. But if you have all the pieces, I could believe in it, and it would be a space where now we're into the more controlling space, so you can splash. Maybe this is a Mardu Reanimator deck instead, so that you can get some of the white stuff in once you've gone down that line. And in the Reanimator episode, I did talk about how there's some room, red doesn't add a lot to basically the problem is that red doesn't add a lot to this whole plan, right? My big question is okay, so you got all these uncommon reanimation spells, you got the good reanimation targets. Why are you red? White offers all the same tools. Maybe white's just cut and red's open, I guess, is the answer. And Fear of Burning Alive specifically, I guess, is a draw to red. So I don't know. I guess I'd file it under can happen, isn't something you should expect or draft to, but anytime you can be well, these cards in this set exist, it's a coherent strategy, someone's going to draft that deck at some point. I guess kind of what I'm saying is In all cases, when I'm talking about what decks you should and shouldn't draft, what is possible is a lot more important than what's not possible. Like, if I say you shouldn't do something, that means generally, or like you shouldn't expect it early in a draft. But like, drafts are weird, right? Anything can happen. That's kind of the fun. And so, like, saying you shouldn't usually do this usually won't come together, there's not a lot of support for this, none of that ever means this will never happen and you can't do it. And like those exceptional decks are sweet and fun and come up, but they're usually exceptional for a reason, and they're usually not something that you can like plan for. All right, so I'm going to wrap it up there. Thank you very much for listening. Especially thank you to everyone in Twitch chat for the questions. And I'll be back next week. Same time, same place, same schedule for further coverage of Duskmourn. So have a good week, everyone. And if you're playing in the Arena Open this weekend, good luck. Bye for now.